And so, of course, I want to welcome our speaker today, Omar Zahzah. Omar is an organizer, a writer, and a poet of Lebanese Palestinian descent. He's also an assistant professor of Arab, Muslim, Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies in the Department of Race and Resistance Studies at the San Francisco State University. And briefly, before he gives his talk, I'd like to give you all a sense of what Speak Out Now is and what we stand for before he begins. So just like all of us gathered here today, we oppose the genocidal war that's on the Palestinian people and the spread of the Israeli-US war into Lebanon and the surrounding countries. That spreading is threatening an even wider war in the region, as we're going to discuss today. And in the face of massive worldwide opposition, the United States government has announced, I'm sure you've known, that it's sending troops to Israel along with an advanced US anti-missile system, and thus continuing to attempt to provoke the Iranian regime into war or into submission. Meanwhile, as Israeli forces intensify their assault on Lebanon, Israel has openly declared a new stage of the war on the people of Gaza. During its one-year bombardment and ground assault on Gaza, Israel has prevented the basics of life from entering. Water, food, fuel, and medical supplies are being kept out, and the consequence has been devastating. Many are on the brink of starvation, medical care is inaccessible as hospitals have been targeted, and now they're preparing to starve the people in northern Gaza while simultaneously bombing them. Israel's final solution is out in the open. We all can see it. And the US continues to aid and abet the war crimes that are going on. So this situation and the state that the world is in is calling for a major change. And the elections that will occur next month in this country have nothing to do with what we believe are the kinds of changes that we need to make. US elections present a choice between two politicians in a competition to manage this system of imperialist domination of the planet. And that can only guarantee that this kind of massacre in Palestine continues and the destruction of life throughout the world. In this world of conflicts, we have to choose a side. We're building an organization now to fight the system and replace it with socialism, a system that respects the lives and the needs of all human beings and is organized to preserve life on this earth and all of its inhabitants. This starts with mass social mobilizations like the ones that we've seen in the past year opposing the war on the people of Gaza. And it moves through organizing on this and on other questions that are confronting us toward a social revolution. And to bring about these massive systemic changes, we need to understand the nature of the system that's responsible for the damage and destruction. And we need to engage more people in consciously mobilizing not only to oppose the horrific impacts of the system, but to replace the system itself. To build a different society, we believe we need an organization that's deeply rooted in the working class that can lead the struggles ahead. This organization doesn't exist right now. Building it is actually up to individuals today. We may be just a few people now, but we know that our forces can grow stronger through the struggles that are coming on. And that's the aim of Speak Out Now. If you would like to see a different world, we would like to encourage you to reach out. If you're on Zoom today, you can do this by messaging us on Instagram, emailing us, or by using the contact information in the chat. If you're at an event in person, find someone to talk to after the event who belongs to Speak Out Now. There's really something that each of us can do to organize and bring about this kind of massive change. But now on to our discussion for today. We're going to hear from Omar Zahzah, and then we'll have some time to follow up with questions and comments from people around the country. So please welcome Omar Zahzah.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Speak Out Socialists for, this generous invitation. I want to start by saying that, when I was reached out to to speak, I was asked to do something that I think as academics we're not generally very good at doing, which is to speak to people who are not necessarily part of your political party, or people who may not, even necessarily be in academia themselves. And so I definitely put a lot of thought into, okay, how do we address this topic in a way that is accessible to, you know, people coming into this conversation from multiple terrains. And on that note, I also wanted to flag that at San Francisco State University, where we had the first successful divestment um, from companies complicit in human rights violations using a human rights framework. Part of the encampment that led to that divestment process, we've sort of built upon that by, as faculty now, Faculty for Justice in Palestine, thinking about how do we also bring the classroom out of the complicit institution of the university itself, and think about actually bringing, connecting and learning and building with one another. So I'm glad to see that there's initiatives like this, all across the Bay. And I think that this is part and parcel of the broader movement, that is calling for an end to genocide and a liberated world. So that I'm going to start going over some thoughts that I put together. And although, I've tried to kind of present them in kind of a generalized framework, hopefully they will be useful. And I hope that they can be a good sort of introduction to a robust conversation in the Q&A. As we see atrocity after atrocity play across our phones, or read yet another headline about the Middle East, combining technical jargon with alarmist or even apocalyptic political overtones, it's probably safe to assume that one question that comes to mind is, what exactly is going on? And since we've now crossed an unthinkable threshold, being as we are over a year into what has been described as the first live stream genocide in history, that question probably rotates in close circulation to another. How is this still happening? As it so happens, these questions are closely related. They represent not just us and our potential feelings, our confusion, and especially our outrage, but they also reflect how the moral indefensibility of genocide is so patent that, next to the digitally preserved horrors of Israel's genocide of Palestinians itself, the most shocking thing of all may very well be the presumption by so-called experts and politicians, Israeli, US, and their allies alike, that this is something that can simply be hidden behind a wall of bureaucraties, as though it were just another so-called blip on the stock market or a question of infrastructure. And if that doesn't work, there's always the tried and true appeal to the optics of scary, resisting brown people, usually quote unquote radical Muslims. But in addition to our own innate sense of ethics, these questions also reflect how much our political system really depends on keeping us unaware of information that would contradict with the US's global policies. We're at a moment now where we're seeing the contradictions and the deep immorality of these policies play out right before our eyes. And with little to go on besides the by now meaningless refrains of Israel being the perpetual victim and the US being a superpower dedicated to peace and justice, it makes perfect sense that we start needing to look elsewhere for our information. So, what is going on? And how is Israel's latest genocide of the Palestinian people not only still happening, but seemingly entrenching into a broader regional war that the US is not only allowing to continue, but fully funding, supporting, and even assuming an active role in? Right? We've seen, as was mentioned, right, the US now confirmed to send not only an active missile system, but grounds on the troop in Israel, in addition to bombings in Syria and Yemen. Here, I'd like to propose that structural categories can help us make sense of political developments. And when I say structural categories, I mean categories that refer to the particular ways that nations, including nation states, as well as the smaller institutions of which they're made up, act and move with one another, and in relationship to the broader global landscape. For me, it's really difficult to make sense of the events we're seeing unfold unless we accept the following structural conditions. First, that the US is an imperialist and even hegemonic superpower, and acting in such a way as to preserve those traits. And this includes acting in a way to fully bolster Israel, which is a settler colonial state and whose own imperialist ambitions remain unfulfilled, even as it has made great progress in its original goal of colonizing Palestine and eliminating, if not driving out, its indigenous Palestinian population. Now, imperialism generally refers to the process by which an actor, subjugates another, usually a state, right, often through territorial acquisition by a process involving military means, and subject those subordinated to its will to vast inequality for its own gain, normally seeking returns such as raw materials, wealth, or general political advantage in a broader regional sense. Hegemony has many different interrelated definitions, but suffice it to say that it refers to a domination that is not necessarily just defined by superior military means alone. It can also capture a generalized aura of cultural or political superiority that is reinforced through belief based foundations that determine market conventions and political relationships. Since World War II, the US has been the premier global military superpower, and it has used a variety of means to maintain its domination. Now, in the region we're looking at today, this is especially meant supporting Israel and that state's own colonial and imperialist ambitions and practices. And here we get to the next structural characteristic in defining Israel as a settler colonial state. This means that Israel, like the US, is a state that defines itself through the seizure of indigenous lands and the expulsion, if not outright elimination, of its indigenous inhabitants, the Palestinians. Zionism is the name for the belief system that advocates for the existence of Israel as the settler colonial state we know it as today, meaning a state at the expense of the original Palestinian population. Began as a movement in the 19th century that proposed the physical nation state as a solution to countering rampant European anti Semitism. At the time, Zionism was only one out of many political responses to anti Semitism, and just as today, there are many Jews who define themselves as anti Zionist. But this is another important historical fact. Zionism would have stayed a fringe European settler movement if it didn't have material support. We wouldn't have a physical colonial nation state called Israel today if it weren't for European imperialism, something that the earliest Zionist leaders like Theodor Herzl knew very well. The success of Zionism has always necessitated a collaboration between settler colonialism and Western imperialism. This is why the Zionist movement first solicited the support of what was initially the great imperial superpower of its day, Great Britain. It was Great Britain which issued the infamous Balfour Declaration in 1917, which promised the land of Palestine to the Zionist movement. And though the relationship between the Zionist political project and the British government would eventually sour, this would occur not too long before the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, founded as it would continue to be maintained up to this day in droves of violent ethnic cleansing and murder. And who would come to assume the mantle left by now not so Great Britain, but the United States, who in 1967 was the new global behemoth? Since that time, the special relationship between the US and Israel has meant that, through Israel, the imperialist US is granted a militarized proxy state that acts in its own interest and maintains Western hegemony through its localized military and colonial occupation policies. Make no mistake, the US supports Israel because supporting Israel helps it to maintain its own regional and ultimately global dominance. Beneath the surface of ostensible finger wagging disapproval with Israel's actions lies a hidden world of material benefit from Israeli colonial violence, including, but not limited to, the acquisition of lethal weapons tested on Palestinians in the quote unquote laboratory of Gaza, which also enriches a thriving US arms industry, the exporting of police trainings, surveillance technologies, and so called crowd control tactics, meaning practices to crush civil disobedience, and more. Now, of course, when there is oppression, there is going to be resistance. No colonized or imperialized people in history has ever happily accepted its violent subjugation by a suppressive power, and Palestinians are no different. The Palestinians first resisted the imperial British presence on their land and the burgeoning Zionist settler movement that displaced them through various means, including a massive general strike in 1936. And in the mid 1960s, you had the rise of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, which, operating primarily in exile, led the modern Palestinian National War of Liberation against the Zionist state through multiple means, including armed resistance. More broadly, you also see global struggles for decolonization and various national revolutions that overthrow Western backed autocratic regimes. This is what happens in Iran in 1979, and the rise of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps follows the ouster of the Western-backed Shah. It's important to note here that the Iranian Revolution is also connected to the broader Third World liberation struggle, with the IRCG also drawing from the examples of Ahmad bin Bala of Algeria, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and PLO guerrillas provided training to members of the IRGC. And I want to flag here that I'm drawing a lot of this analysis from somebody named Hamad Attai in Middle East Eye, which is a publication I highly recommend everyone read, and I'm happy to make more recommendations during the Q&A. When we refer today, what we refer to today, as the axis of resistance emerges after the aforementioned Iranian Revolution, Iraq's 1980 invasion of Iran, and Israel's bloody 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which ultimately culminates in the infamous Sabra and Shatila massacre. Now, Iraq is worried about the Iranian Revolution, while Israel is trying to drive out the PLO and ultimately concerned about potential regional alliance with Iran. Meanwhile, Iran moves closer to Syria, given that both regimes have concerns about Saddam Hussein's aims, as well as that Lebanon could fall to neighboring Arab countries that have recognized the Israeli state and abandoned the cause of the Palestinian national liberation struggle. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon resulted in the massacre of nearly 50,000 Lebanese and Palestinian people. But even as Israel was able to drive out the PLO, its occupation also gave rise to Hezbollah, a new capable armed resistance force and party that by 1985 already had the capabilities to push Israeli forces from Beirut to the south of Lebanon. Now, Hamas, as many know, emerges during the First Intifada, which spans from around 1987 to 1993. But by the mid 1990s, another important detail is that you have the rise of the Oslo Accords, which sees the PLO, and here primarily Fatah, the largest party, by large accounts abandoning, the armed liberation struggle to engage in negotiated peace talks with Israel before they had succeeded in achieving any kind of guaranteed return of land or real political concessions from the colonial state. This agreement eventually gives rise to the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, now led by Mahmoud Abbas, which acts as a kind of subcontractor to the Israeli occupation and colonization process. In contrast to the PLO, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were seen as carrying on the mantle of armed resistance and, by extension, the National Liberation Project through really the Second Intifada, especially up to the present day. Now, it's also crucial to note that from its founding in ethnic cleansing and massacre to its present policies, the Israeli state had done nothing but steal more land and dispossess more and more people. Prior to the current order of affairs, it was Israel that would routinely break ceasefires and then blame Hamas when the group eventually retaliated. Now, the U.S. is working with Israel to reframe ceasefire from being an authentic, bilaterally negotiated process towards a stalling tactic that allows Israel to continue its genocide while being materially replenished by the U.S. Now that Israel is trying to expand its war against the Palestinian people vis-a-vis its Gaza genocide to a broader regional war involving Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran, and stamp out the resistance forces that rightfully oppose its colonial and imperialist presence, the U.S., long Israel's biggest backer, in its own cynical and yet foolhardy attempt to preserve its broader global hegemony, seems to be actively supporting in this endeavor, no doubt hoping, against all hope and evident conditions, that Israel will return to the military capabilities it possessed decades ago and be able to rely on strategies beyond carpet bombings, targeted assaults on civilians, and starvation, and so on. The U.S. is pushing and now apparently directly intervening in regional war in the foolish hope that a new anti-imperial and anti-colonial resistance that has been decades in the making will eventually crumble in the face of the settler colonial entity it continues to back. And it does so knowing full well that it is not its own government or its people that will pay the price, but the Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, and Iranians. It does so out of full, arrogant rejection of the reality that guerrilla forces throughout history have defeated powerful colonial and imperialist forces. With the U.S. empire apparently fixated on preserving its imperial regional stronghold, no matter the costs and no matter who's in office, as we heard earlier, it's up to all people of conscience to continue to raise the alarms, to end the Gaza genocide, to free Palestine from the river to the sea, and to stop U.S. imperialist meddling and collusion. No to all U.S.-backed war. Thank you.